Welcome everybody to what is the fifth Ed Conrad Memorial Lecture and the third hosted by Studies in Religion at UQ in the School of Historical and Philosophical Inquiry. I'd like to begin on behalf of everyone, with acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which we meet and their custodianship of these lands. I pay our respects to their ancestors and their descendants who continue cultural and spiritual connections to country. We recognise their valuable contributions to Australian and global society. I'd also like to acknowledge the presence of Professor Lisa Featherstone, the head of the School of Historical and Philosophical Inquiry, Dr. Linda Conrad, our patron. Thank you again for supporting this event in which we get to acknowledge Ed and his contribution to the university, so thank you very much. And also distinguished guests and UQ colleagues. There's numerous Emeriti. I can't remember, Phil, if I got the plural right on this occasion, but you can correct me later, who are here. This is a picture of Ed. This lecture series was developed to acknowledge Ed and his contributions to the university, but also acknowledge the area of research in which he spent a great deal of his academic life, which was the reception of biblical texts. And what Ed was trying to do when in that mode of research was to challenge what had been the tradition that dominated biblical studies, which was text historical work, and Ed was suggesting that perhaps people are missing that these texts are alive in communities of reception. People are interested in interpreting them as holistic texts, as narrative texts that are not necessarily just through the text historical method which had dominated academia to that point. Now, in the context of that work, Ed produced 4 monographs. I think the most well-known is Reading Isaiah, and also 3 edited volumes as well. So he made a significant contribution to this field. Now today, in that light, it's very appropriate that we are going to hear from Professor Philip Almond. Phil was a long-time head of Studies in Religion at UQ. He was also the inaugural head of the School of History, Philosophy, Religion and Classics, which then became known as the School of Historical and Philosophical Inquiry. He is, if you don't mind me saying, Phil, a bit of a UQ institution in himself, and he's been a very important figure in the lives of myself and my colleagues who are currently laughing at me over there in the corner. Now, Phil don't mind me saying this, Phil, a bit from the old school of Studies in Religion. He's got an incredible breadth of knowledge about religion, and that's reflected in his publication history. Phil is actually up to about 15 books. I think 16's on the way. 16 is about Noah, which is appropriate given the eschatology we're about to face with climate change. So we'll all be busily reading that and looking for how we're going to be saved. Now, of those 15 books, it represents an incredible diversity. There's a monograph on Rudolf Otto, there's monographs on mysticism, there's contributions to Islam, there's a very highly cited book in an area a bit closer to my own on Buddhism, on the British discovery of Buddhism. In more recent times, I think over maybe the last decade, Phil has mastered this kind of monographic style, where he's picked on a particular theme or a figure in religious history and written a monograph detailing the intellectual history of that person or that idea. And so if I just go through a few, forthcoming is a book on the Buddha. Prior to that was a book on Mary Magdalene, a book on which we're going to hear today. Then we had the Antichrist, God, a new biography. I think there have been some before it as well. Then the afterlife, the devil, and so on. And I think you're on about a monograph a year, which is pretty remarkable output. So I don't want to speak any longer. I want to hand the audience over to Phil. Thank you all very much for coming. Phil, I invite you up, and I know we're in good hands.
Thank you, Adam, and thank you all very much for coming to tonight's Ed Conrad Memorial Lecture. Just a personal note by way of beginning. Ed and I sustained a friendship over 35 years, actually, since we first met at a conference in 1977, and Linda and I just sorted out that we also met at that same conference in 1977. And over the 14 years that I had the privilege of being the head of the Department of Studies in Religion here at UQ, Ed was my go-to man for consultation, for advice, for support, and sometimes, well, more often than I care to admit, for consolation. Those of you who knew Ed will remember him as a good, a kind, and a generous man, and I'm very pleased and honoured to be delivering this lecture in memory of Ed. And so, to Mary Magdalene. Now, within Eastern and Western Christianity, Mary Magdalene is one of the most important saints. After Mary, the mother of Jesus, she's by far the most important female saint, and this was because she was the archetype of the penitent sinner. It was she who most demonstrated to everyone that no one was beyond redemption. So tonight's presentation is not, however, about Mary Magdalene. Rather, it's about the idea of the Magdalene from the New Testament period to the present. So it's a history of how and why Christianity, with the minimal historical data at its disposal, created its ideal Christian saint. It reveals how she represented the sinner we should all aspire not to be and the saint that we should all desire to become. Now, it would be hard to write a book on Mary Magdalene herself, for what we do know can virtually be written on a small index card. So what do we know? Well, outside of the New Testament Gospels, there's nothing. And the Gospels themselves tell us little. Now, according to them, she had once been possessed by demons, but they had gone from her. A very late passage added to the Gospel of Mark tells us that it was Jesus who exorcised her demons. Now, of course, if we're not inclined to accept the reality of demonic possession, we would need to interpret what that might all mean. She may have come from a town called Magdala, but the identification of this town now is problematic. And that said, even the name Magdalene may not be the name of the town from which she came, but a nickname rather than her place of origin. For as we know, Jesus was fond of giving his followers nicknames. Think of Peter the Rock, James and John, the sons of thunder. If so, Mary or Magdalene may mean nothing more than the Tower of Strength or the High Tower. She was probably a wealthy woman who, along with some other women, provided for Jesus and his disciples. She was present at the crucifixion, and we are told she was the first person at the resurrection of Jesus. Again, if you're not inclined to believe in the resurrection of Jesus from the dead, this too will need a rethink, and it was rethought in the 19th century. And finally, it was she who informed the disciples of Jesus that Jesus had risen from the dead. That's it. That's all we know. And yet it was this very paucity of information that made possible and necessary the construction within Christianity of an array of lives of Mary Magdalene over the next 2,000 years. She would become the woman for all seasons, available for all times, adaptable to all occasions, and accessible to all people, both men and women. And this was because, as we will see, there were many different Mary Magdalenes. She was the penitent prostitute and the woman possessed by 7 demons. She was the first witness to the resurrection and the first to inform the disciples of it. She was the wife and lover of Jesus and the bride at the wedding of Cana in Galilee. She was the model for the contemplative monastic life, and she was the solitary desert dweller whose nakedness was covered by her hair. She was a symbol both of the ascetic on the one hand and the erotic on the other. She was the female leader of the early church, the wealthy heiress and the party girl from Magdala. Symbolically, she was the second Eve and the bride of Christ. But there are two other stories within the New Testament that are crucial for the idea of Mary. On the one hand, there's the story in the Gospel of John of Mary of Bethany. She was the sister of Martha and Lazarus, and she it was who anointed Jesus' feet with a costly perfume of pure nard and wiped them with her hair. On the other hand, in the Gospel of Luke, there's the story of the sinful woman. She too anointed Jesus' feet with ointment from an alabaster jar, bathed them with her tears, and dried them with her hair. Now, within the Eastern Church, Mary Magdalene remained the single Mary of the New Testament, which I outlined at the beginning. But in the Western Church, from the year 600, she became a composite figure. For it was then, in 591, to be precise, that Pope Gregory the Great preached a sermon in which he identified her both with Mary of Bethany on the one hand and the fallen woman of the Gospel of Luke on the other. And as a result of this identification, Mary now becomes two things within the Western Church. On the one hand, she becomes the repentant prostitute. On the other, because she sat quietly at the feet of Jesus while Martha slaved away in the kitchen, she became the ideal of the monastic rather than the activist life. So this relationship between the single Mary on the one hand and the composite Mary on the other provides a narrative framework within which tonight I'll try to tell the story of the idea of the Magdalene. And that said, the idea of Mary Magdalene over the past two millennia has been a fluid and unstable one, not least because of her many personae and her triple identity. But that said, we can identify 6 key moments in her history. First, as indicated already, there was the creation of the composite Mary Magdalene by Gregory the Great at the end of the 6th century. And Gregory's construction brought to a conclusion some 5.5 centuries of discussion and debate about the identity, role and significance of Mary Magdalene. The second moment was the creation of the lives of Mary on the basis of Gregory the Great's identification of her with Mary of Bethany and the fallen woman of the Gospel of Luke. So somewhere between 860 and 1050, we see the creation of the first full biography of Mary, entitled A Sermon in Veneration of the Holy Mary Magdalene, and traditionally it's been attributed to the Benedictine Odo, the Bishop of Cluny. Now, I'll refer to him as Odo from here on because saying pseudo-Odo 1,000 times is more difficult than I'm prepared to contemplate. So, he didn't write it, but this provided the template for all later stories of the life of Mary before the ascension of Christ. And it was written for a monastic audience who, listening to this sermon, would have learnt of an historical Magdalene who foreshadowed the church, modelled the inner life of contemplation, and was next to Mary, the mother of Jesus, an exemplar of the spiritual life. Now, for Odo, Mary, the mother of Jesus, and Mary Magdalene were equally important as exemplars of the Christian life. As the first witness to the resurrection, it was she, and not the mother of Jesus, who could open the gates of paradise to the sinner ready to repent. And as the repentant sinner, Mary Magdalene was more accessible to the Christian, whether monastic or lay, than the sinless maternal Virgin Mary. Ironically, the increasing veneration of Mary, the mother of Jesus, during the High Middle Ages created a large devotional space for Mary Magdalene. As Marina Warner remarks, the more Mary, the mother of Jesus, was held to be free of all taint and sin, actual and original, the less the ordinary sinner could turn to her for consolation in his weakness, and the more he needed the individual saints whose own lapses held out hope for him. Unlike Mary, the mother of Jesus, Mary Magdalene was a sinner like us and a model of redemption by Jesus. If even she can be saved, so can we. So with the first biography of Mary Magdalene, Odo made possible a new role for Mary. She was not only the repentant sinner forgiven by Jesus for her devotion, but she was able to fill the gap between the sinful Eve on the one hand and the sinless mother of Jesus on the other. Ironically, perhaps, she provided an exemplar for men. Odo was, after all, writing for and preaching to a male audience. And in his sinful feminine soul, anima peccatrix, each man could find the sinful yet penitent Magdalene. But Odo also suggested that for women she had a greater significance, not least because it was believed they carried a double burden. The first was for being sinners. This they shared with men. The other was for being women, the daughters of Eve, the architect of the fall of man. For Odo, Mary, the mother of Jesus, seemed to have solved the problem for sinners generally. But Odo was carving out a very special place for Mary in the spiritual life of women. And so he declared, through Blessed Mary Magdalene, the reproach of the female sex was wiped away. On the plus side, Mary Magdalene had opened up the path to redemption for women. But that said, she had also shown that the path to salvation was a steeper one than it was for men. Now, this life of Mary, which was focused on her life before the ascension of Jesus, exemplified in this sermon of Odo, was supplemented by a complex textual tradition of her life after the ascension of Jesus. And we can classify these in three different forms: the Vita Eremitica, the Vita Apostolica, and the Vita Apostolica Eremitica. Now, in the first of these, the Vita Eremitica, Mary fits into the long Christian tradition of the harlot saint and of the desert mothers. Here's a simple version from the Old English martyrology from about 800 to 900. Quote, "And after Christ's ascension, her longing for him was so great that she never wanted to see another man again. And so she went into the desert and lived there for 30 years, unknown to all men. She never ate human food nor drank, but at every prayer time, God's angels came from heaven and lifted her up into the air. And there she heard some of the heavenly bliss, and then they carried her back to her cave. And for that reason, she was never hungry or thirsty. And then after 30 years, a holy priest came across her in the desert, and he led her to his church and gave her the Eucharist. And she gave up the ghost to God, and the priest buried her, and great miracles often happened at her tomb." In the next version of her life, the Vita, in the next version of her life, the Vitae Apostolicae from the early 11th century, she becomes the preaching Mary. In its summary form, the story goes something like this. After the ascension of Mary, Mary Magdalene, along with her sister Mary, it's Mary of Bethany, of course, Mary Magdalene, along with her sister Martha, her brother Lazarus, and the disciple Maximinus, travelled to France. And there, Mary continued her contemplative life, but she also preached to the unbelievers or confirmed believers in their faith. She performed miracles to establish the truth of her words and to provoke faith in her listeners. She cared little for food and clothing, but the women who were with her provided for her needs. Although she remained on earth in the flesh, quote, she was nonetheless permitted to walk in spirit amid the delights of paradise, on whose ineffable sweetness she feasted as much as possible for a mortal. Mary Magdalene, it is said, died on the 22nd of July, the day on which her memorial is still kept, after having a vision of Christ summoning her to heaven. Quote, "Come, my beloved, and I shall place you on my throne, for the King desires your beauty more lovely than any of the sons of men." And thirdly, then, there is a combined Vita Apostolica with the Vita Eremitica, which is found preeminently in the golden legend of the Dominican monk Jacobus da Voragine, in which, after her life in France, she retires again to the wilderness, there to remain for 30 years, eating only, as he put it, of the good things of heaven. And 7 times every day she was carried aloft by angels, where she heard the chants of the heavenly host. Satisfied with the supernatural food, she required no material nourishment, eventually dying in the wilderness. Now, the third moment in the history of Mary goes to the development of the cult of Mary around her remains. And without putting too fine a point on it today, 5 narrative traditions grew up and around the remains of Mary Magdalene, mostly centred on various pilgrimage sites in Palestine, Ephesus, Constantinople, in France in Vézelay, and in France at Saint-Maximin. Sufficient to say that her remains were dotted from Ephesus to York, and teasing out the history of them is messy and complex, not least because fake relics, relic trading, and relic stealing were the medieval equivalents of modern antique and fine art markets. And the possession and display of relics was at the heart of the medieval tourist industry. Did the stories of her afterlife reflect or create the relic industry around Mary Magdalene? Well, we don't know. But in keeping with her increased status in the West and with access to traditional pilgrimage sites in the Holy Land made difficult, if not impossible, with Muslim expansion into the area, the locus of her relic industry became Europe. Now, this was especially the case after the year 1204, for it was in that year that those on the Fourth Crusade took one look at the treasures of Constantinople, promptly abandoned their quest to the Holy Land, and quite simply looted the joint. Better to take home saintly souvenirs than risk your life fighting the Saracens. So, for example, Bishop Conrad of Halberstadt in Saxony, who accompanied the crusade, made something of a killing, so to say, in the relics market. And amongst the earthly treasures with which he arrived back in Halberstadt were the blood of Christ, Jesus' crown of thorns, his shroud, his purple garment, and his sandals. And he also had some of the Virgin Mary's hair, the skull of St. John the Baptist, the shin bone of St. Peter, the arm of Simon the Apostle, the head of St. James, the shoulder of St. Philip, the arm of St. Barnabas, and a portion of the skull of St. Stephen. But leading the relics of the female saints was the skull of Mary Magdalene, followed by the hand and arm of Euphemia, the Virgin, and along with that, relics of Lucy, Margaret, Catherine, and Barbara. So if Conrad arrived back in Germany with the head of Mary Magdalene, what happened to the rest of her? Well, we have no evidence that either in Ephesus or Constantinople, Mary had been divided into parts. So in Constantinople, there was probably a complete body. So more than likely, Conrad took all of her along with him when he returned from the crusade. But interestingly, we do know that on his way back from Constantinople, he detoured from Venice to Rome to visit Pope Innocent III. Conrad kept Mary's head, but we can suggest he gave the rest to the Pope. For we do know that eventually she did come to rest, albeit without her head, in an altar dedicated to her in St John Lateran in Rome around about the year 1216. Now, complete or virtually complete bodies aside, various parts of Mary Magdalene were to be found across Europe. Even a London parish in 1480 could contain a sizable relic collection with a contribution from Mary Magdalene. So, for example, kept in a small chest in the Church of St Stephen, Walbrook, were 22 relics, and among these was a relic of the place where Christ appeared to Mary Magdalene, and kept, or rather, most prolific within the English list of the relics of Mary was, perhaps not surprisingly, her hair, of which she had an abundance. 12 pieces of her locks were held at various sites, along with a comb or two. Her hair was also abundant in many places all over Europe. But within these English lists, we also find a toe, 3 fingers, some of the ointment with which she managed to massage the feet of Christ, rings, 4 items of her clothing, and a belt. And there was no shortage of fingers either. England, as we noted above, had 3. The Franciscans in Sulmona in Italy had 1 in a silver reliquary. St. Martha in Tarascon, St. Victor in Marseille, and San Marco in Venice all claimed to have fingers. The relic collection in Hulla had 2 fingers with bones in a silver reliquary, along with some of her hair. Saint Maximin claimed 1 arm, while Cologne claimed to have 2. There were others in Sicily, Hanau, Marseille, Venice, and Fécamp. 1 relic that a man called Hugh of Lincoln took a bite out, take away relics, all up a total of 8 arms. And St John the Baptist of the Florentines in Rome possessed 1 of her feet. St Maximum held a reliquary with her head, and Abbeville claimed to have her skull, while the Dominican nuns of Aix had her jaw. And aside from parts of her body, other relics connected to her life were popular. La Nunziatella outside of Rome had a fragment of the cave in which she did penance. St John Lateran in Rome held a piece of her hair shirt. Santa Croce in Rome had the stone slab upon which Jesus laid when he forgave her sins. La Trinité de Vendôme held a teardrop of Christ from the tears Jesus wept when he heard of the death of Lazarus, caught by an angel and placed in a container that was given to Mary Magdalene for safekeeping. The Frari in Venice held a drop of Christ's blood mixed with the ointment of Mary Magdalene that had come to it from Constantinople. Saint Maximin possessed a reliquary that held bits of blood-soaked stones from Golgotha that Mary Magdalene had brought to France. The blood was said to liquefy annually on Good Friday. But Saint Maximin in France had perhaps the most noteworthy of all. And this was supposedly an uncorrupted piece of the skin on Mary Magdalene's forehead, which Jesus had touched when he forbade her from touching him after his resurrection. So the 4th moment in the idea of Mary came at the beginning of the 16th century. And this was a debate within France about the single Mary versus the composite Mary. It broke out in earnest between Renaissance humanists, Catholic theologians, and eventually Protestant reformers and Protestant radicals. It was a debate that threatened the viability of the cult of Mary and the veracity of her relics. For from this time on, the separation of the penitent prostitute from Mary Magdalene undermined the narrative within the West of Mary Magdalene as the repentant sinner. In 1518, questions about the authenticity of the relics of Mary in southern France generated a debate about her identity that was to rage from 1580 to the early 1520s, and it was to result in the production of some 20 books on the matter. It was an argument about the life and the afterlife of Mary Magdalene at a time when the West itself was thinking through how to balance the traditions of the Western Church against the revival of classical antiquity in Renaissance humanism. And at the forefront of the debate was a Catholic humanist by the name of Jacques Lefebvre d'Etaples. Initially, in his first work, Lefebvre distinguished the composite Mary Magdalene into three separate people: an anonymous sinful woman and two other women. The Mary Magdalene, so named in the Gospels, named after the town of Magdala, and another Mary Magdalene, named Magdalene after her castle in Bethany, who was the same person as Mary of Bethany, the sister of Martha and Lazarus. Subsequently, in a later work, he gave up his two Mary Magdalenes for one. She who Jesus delivered of seven demons became his disciple and was present at the resurrection. That said, on the 9th of November in 1521, Lefebvre's views on Mary Magdalene were officially censured by the Faculty of Theology at the Sorbonne in Paris. His works were not placed on the index of prohibited works in France, but they were added to the Spanish index in 1551 and the Roman index in 1559. The empire was striking back, and it was assigned to the Catholic humanists, Erasmus among them, that they would do well to leave popular piety alone. And the church had hit back for a number of reasons. First, it hit back because the argument that Mary was not identical with either the repentant prostitute or Mary of Bethany threw into question the liturgical practice of the church that had celebrated both Mary of Bethany and Mary Magdalene as the same person on the same day, the 22nd of July, for at least 800 years. And second, and probably more importantly, it brought into question the viability of the cult of the Magdalene in Europe that had been focused specifically on the identity of Mary of Bethany with Mary Magdalene. And third, it therefore raised questions about the authenticity of the relics in Provence. This not only seriously threatened the economies of the pilgrimage sites, St. Maximin and St. Bone, that were each dependent on the relics being those of Mary Magdalene. If Mary Magdalene was not Mary of Bethany, then the bones in France were not those of the Magdalene at all, but of Mary of Bethany. For it was she, who we recall from the Vita Apostolica, who had travelled to France with her sister Martha and her brother Lazarus. Now, as is well known, the Reformation was in part provoked by the abuses that surrounded the cult of relics in the church. And it's probably fair to say that this big debate that raged about Mary Magdalene got postponed for another minor glitch in the history of the Christian church, something called the Reformation, something like that. So it all faded away as the Reformation roared into gear and Luther became more important than the identity of Mary Magdalene. The Reformers, however, were not past appropriating the saints for their own use. Martin Luther, for example, accepted that Mary Magdalene and Mary of Bethany were the same person. So for Luther, the contemplative Mary evidenced salvation by faith, rather than over against the active Martha, who exemplified salvation by works. For Luther, the contemplative life could now be practiced by all, not just enclosed monks and nuns. That said, Luther was no 16th century feminist. Simply put, Mary was saved by faith, but like Martha, she was still expected to do the housework under a stern yet benevolent and companionable patriarchal gaze. And women were accordingly expected to be, like Mary, pious, quiet, submissive, and obedient, and like Martha, to get on with the housekeeping and the child rearing. Luther and his Genevan counterpart, John Calvin, didn't approve of women teaching, regardless of their in-principle equality of men. But in contrast to Lutheranism and Calvinism, the 17th century English movement known as Quakerism fully endorsed the role of women as preachers. The Quakers' robust endorsement of women preachers was based on Mary Magdalene having been the one who told the disciples of Christ's resurrection, quote, "Now you that make," declared their founder George Fox, "a scoff and a wonder at a woman's preaching, you may see that it was Mary that first preached Christ after he was risen. So be ashamed and confounded forever, and let your mouths be stopped forever that despise the spirit of prophecies in the daughters. Fifthly, the rise of the Protestant tradition aligned with an incipient Western secularisation. And this alignment generated a new proliferation of Marys, the thoroughly modern Mary, now viewed as either the single or the composite Mary. Her identity became even more malleable and indeterminate. Separated from harlotry, she became a model of sanctity, but separated from sanctity, she became profane, sensual, and erotic. Now, it was in the middle of the 19th, no it wasn't, it was in the middle of the 16th century that the English theologian Bishop John Jewell noticed something different about artistic representations of Mary. He saw that she'd been eroticised. Now, in a sermon on worship of images, Jewell questioned the value of religious paintings that, rather than endorsing virtue, appeared to encourage its opposite. And he condemned the trend, he said, wherein is set forth by the art of the painter an image with a nice and wanton apparel and countenance, more like to Venus or Flora than Mary Magdalene, or if like to Mary Magdalene, it's when she played the harlot rather than when she wept for her sins. Now, this was an astute observation, because it was during the first decades of the 16th century that Mary Magdalene had been transformed in Italy into a Venus-like figure, a goddess of love. We might say that where previously the emphasis had been on the repentant sinner and her contrition, the stress was now on her exciting and seductive beauty. And we can briefly map this shift in representations of Mary Magdalene by comparing two pictures of her eremitic life. The first is by the Flemish artist Quentin Metzers, the second by the Italian painter Titian. Now, in the first of these, Mary appeared naked, her nudity covered by her long hair. Here Mary is both sexless and innocent, her long penitence symbolised by her ascetically gaunt appearance. In stark contrast to this, from around the same time, is Titian's The Penitent Mary. Here again, Mary is the naked woman of the eremitic life, although her hair no longer covers her breasts. She was presented as genuinely possessing most of the features of the ideal beauty of the Italian Renaissance: golden hair, white skin flushed with rosy cheeks, ruby lips and dark eyes. Now, this eroticisation of Mary was to reach its peak in a painting entitled The Penitent Mary Magdalene by the Italian painter Francesco Furini. And here, the repentant Mary has really transitioned to what can only be called a kind of pious soft porn. Titian's image of the penitent Magdalene, with its tension between the convert and the coquette, would remain a dominant feature of Mary Magdalene's visual identity well into the 17th century. We find it echoed as late as the middle of the 17th century in The Penitent Magdalene by the Dutch-English painter Peter Lely, principal painter to King Charles II, in which a sensual Mary Magdalene appeared in a cave contemplating a crucifix and a skull. So, a favourite saint, an erotic nude, and an attractive landscape. In the world of high art, Mary Magdalene was very marketable because passion was replacing piety. And without putting too fine a point on it, Mary Magdalene was becoming secularised. She was now a commodity in an art market, more attuned to her being exhibited on the walls of a gallery, a stately home, or a Parisian salon than hung on those of the seminary, church or cathedral, or depicted in the stained glass windows of Gothic cathedrals. And this was a trend to meet its peak in the second half of the 19th century. And here is the actress, Sarah Bernhardt, as Mary Magdalene in a photo from the late 19th century. Now, sixth and finally, Mary has emerged as the most important saint of the last 70 years within the secular West. She became Jesus' wife and lover within a new array of contemporary lives of Jesus that began with Nikos Kazantzakis' book entitled The Last Temptation of Christ. She was featured as Mary Magdalene, of course, in Jesus Christ Superstar, and was central to Dan Brown's The Da Vinci Code. And it ended, as we'll see, with the apparent discovery of an ancient papyrus in 2010 in which Jesus called Mary my wife. But let's focus for the moment on the most influential work to claim that Mary was the wife of Jesus, namely Dan Brown's The Da Vinci Code. Now, the Mary Magdalene of the Da Vinci Code is not the composite Mary of the Western tradition. The book strongly rejects the identification of Mary Magdalene with the sinful woman of the Gospel of Luke. We couldn't have a sinful woman, the penitent whore, marrying Jesus. So Dan Brown's having none of that. The book strongly rejects that identification. It was a smear, it declared, that was invented by the early church to cover up her true role. And this was that Mary had a bloodline reaching back to King Saul, just as Jesus had one reaching back to King David. And these two bloodlines came together when Jesus married Mary, and Mary was therefore, as Brown claims, present at the Last Supper. Leonardo da Vinci, a member of the secret society that supposedly kept these secrets, knew this, and hence he painted Mary into the Last Supper, says Dan Brown. Da Vinci was certainly aware of the fact. The Last Supper practically shouts at the viewer that Jesus and Magdalene were a pair. And just to digress briefly, so Dan Brown would say that that's Mary sitting on the right of Jesus, that the gap between them has the shape of a womb, that it also has the shape of an M standing for marriage. You'll notice that there's no chalice. There's no chalice in the painting. That's because the Holy Grail is sitting next to Jesus, i.e. Mary Magdalene. Well, okay. Whatever. So, let me just go back. So, as Dan Brown says, it practically shouts at the viewer that Jesus and Magdalene were a pair. Well, whispering so quietly that no one has heard it might be more to the point. So Mary, then, is the Holy Grail of Arthurian legend, for she carried within her womb the descendant of the royal Jewish bloodlines. But the Holy Grail is not only the person of Mary Magdalene and the holy blood, but it is also her sarcophagus and the bones within it. The quest for the Holy Grail, we read, is literally the quest to kneel before the bones of Mary Magdalene, a journey to pray at the feet of the outcast one, the lost sacred feminine. So according to the story, the Catholic Church suppressed the tradition of Mary as the Holy Grail, but it also suppressed the tradition of Mary as a goddess. From the time of Constantine in the 4th century, Da Vinci's key villain in the piece, the world was converted from matriarchal paganism to patriarchal feminism by demonising the sacred feminine. The medieval cult of Mary Magdalene was on this account, and his account, the remains of the pre-Christian religion of the goddess. Well, okay. Is there any evidence of a sexual or marital relationship between Jesus and Mary in the early church? Now, for those interested in recent times in exploring the role of women within the early church, the so-called Gnostic Gospels have become a key source, for they seem to offer early Christian resources to those who were opposed to a modern patriarchal Christianity that was intent on keeping women in a subordinate role, both within the church and within society more generally. But to those esoterists or otherwise concerned with exploring the possibility of a physical intimacy or even a marriage between Jesus and Mary Magdalene, the so-called Gospel of Philip was crucial. Now, the relevant passage reads as follows: "As for the wisdom who is called the barren, she is the mother of the angels, and the companion of the Saviour is Mary Magdalene. But Christ loved her more than all the disciples and used to kiss her often on her mouth." Now, among supporters of the marriage thesis, and not merely Dan Brown, this passage is the crucial one. But in the Da Vinci Code, when Sophie Neveu remarked that the above text said nothing of marriage, Sir Lee Teabing pointed out to Sophie Neveu, "Au contraire," he said. As any Aramaic scholar will tell you, the word companion in those days literally meant spouse. Well, actually, as any Aramaic scholar would tell you, the Gospel of Philip was written in Coptic and not in Aramaic. Okay. Cheap shots at Dan Brown aside, as we can see, the text is pretty vague and ambiguous. That said, in one sense, who cares what the Da Vinci Code says? As most people realise, it's a work of fiction, although that hasn't stopped Catholic scholars writing books to declare the Da Vinci Code a hoax. But the desire to prove a relationship of a sexual or marital nature runs deep among the feminist scholars of early Christianity. And so it was, on the evening of the 18th of September 2012, that Harvard Divinity School feminist historian Karen King delivered a paper to the International Congress of Coptic Studies bearing the seemingly harmless title, "A New Coptic Fragment." There, she announced to the world the discovery of a fragment of papyrus only about the size of a credit card, which showed that Jesus and Mary were husband and wife. It came, she believed, from the 4th century. Moreover, this fragment was part of a larger lost gospel, she claimed. I dubbed it, she said, just simply for reference purposes, the Gospel of Jesus' wife. And the fragment that she'd come up with reads as follows: "Not to me my mother gave me life," the disciples said to Jesus. "Deny. Mary is not worthy of it." Jesus said to them, "My wife, she is able to be my disciple." Let wicked people swell up. As for me, I am with her in order to an image. Now, if this tiny piece of papyrus was authentic, then it contained the only known textual evidence from the early Christian world to depict a married Jesus. This was really the Holy Grail, metaphorically in this case, of early Christian studies. Feminist historians and theologians committed to the enhancement of the role of women in the church rejoiced. Not surprisingly, the traditionalists were out in force against her. And so were the scientists generally, although, to be fair, the scientific evidence was compatible with its being both authentic and a fake. That's science for you. Was it authentic? No. Well, no. What we now know is that the Gospel of Jesus' wife was the product of a frustrated German Egyptologist with limited Coptic skills by the name of Walter Fritz, who was then living in Florida. He had obtained a fragment, and actually running a porn site, but that's another story. He had obtained a fragment of centuries-old papyrus, had made ink from ancient recipes, had written a text upon it in passable Coptic, and had created relevant background documents. He offered it to Karen King in July 2010 and had delivered it to her in December 2012, and within a year she was announcing to the world, literally, the discovery of this. Why did Fritz do it? Well, perhaps the Da Vinci Code was the Rosetta Stone. The book, the Da Vinci Code, was the Rosetta Stone of Fritz's motives. The Da Vinci Code's hero, the academic as hero, Harvard professor Robert Langdon, who's naturally, by the way, a professor of religion, kind of religious studies version of Indiana Jones, becomes the real-life Harvard Coptic specialist Karen King. A fanciful reading of Da Vinci's Last Supper now comes to life in an ancient papyrus to provide material proof of the marriage of Jesus and Mary. So Walter Fritz had turned Dan Brown's fantasy into a reality. Now, the overwhelming modern scholarly consensus is that there is no decisive evidence of an early Christian tradition that Jesus and Mary Magdalene were married. Karen King eventually admitted that she had been duped, and her experience will probably ensure that in the immediate future at least, the marriage of Jesus and Mary is a rabbit hole down which no modern scholars will want to go. But here's the rub. The life of Mary Magdalene featured in the Da Vinci Code is a fiction, but it's no more fictional than all the other lives of Mary Magdalene that we've been looking at, produced from the time Odo created his first Life of Mary, based on Mary Magdalene, the fallen woman, and Mary of Bethany. All the lives of Jesus, literally, are pious, or rather all the lives of Mary, I should say, are pious fictions, just as all her relics are pious faiths. With that said, the new possibilities of being in the world that were created by the traditional lives of Mary Magdalene thus continue to the present day. The new alternative lives that have appeared opened up new possibilities. The priesthood of women, the divine goddess, the divine in nature, the key to the legend of the Holy Grail, a beacon of hope for the modern sex worker. So in short, the lives of Mary Magdalene, from the New Testament to the present, they're myths, but they're myths that did matter, and they still do. Thanks very much.